All right, so for our first section of this unit, we're going to mainly be focusing on like national income and price determination, as it's called, which is in a lot of ways a fancy way of saying GDP. First part of this that we're going to look at is going to be aggregate demand, which is another fancy way of saying GDP. A lot of the stuff we're going to work on in here we are going to use for the rest of the course. It's an incredibly important model. It's the most important one that we'll use all year. So if there's anyone to know, it's going to be this one. So aggregate demand. So it's going to show the amount of GDP that's going on in the country. Again, aggregate demand is just going to be a fancy way of saying real GDP. It's essentially everything that is demanded within an economy. All right, so going back to GDP then, there's going to be those four parts of GDP that are in this. That meaning that, consumption, investment, government spending, and our net exports. All four of those and things that change those then will end up changing or shifting aggregate demand, much like our regular demand. So the things that we'll be comparing here are going to be price level and the level of real GDP. There's a bunch of different ways to say these, which we'll get more into when we get more into the graphing portion of this, I assure you. So here we go. This is what aggregate demand looks like. Again, just like regular demand with a bunch of different labels and different significance. As far as graphing this goes, and this will be the same for our entire aggregate model. On the vertical axis, we're going to be comparing price level. There we go. Price level with PL. Price level in some ways is a fancy way of representing inflation, which we'll see much later on in the course. And then down at the bottom, we've got real GDP, or GDPR, or RGDP, or however you want to put it. Something else that's important to know, you can label this as output down here. It could also be output, not just real GDP. It just depends on the approach that you want to take. Now, there's going to be a bunch of different reasons why it's downward sloping, which a lot of these we'll come back to later on in the course. So real balance's effect then is that the economy in a lot of ways, as we're going to see, is self-correcting. And what this pretty much says is that as prices are low, people can afford more, and as prices are high, people can afford less. Right? And it makes sense. The cheaper something is, the more willing people are to buy it. The more expensive something is, the less willing people are to buy it. And that's what all of that means there, is that it ends up balancing itself out because of how people are going to act. Another one's going to be the interest rate effect, and it's the same idea as the real balances effect, because interest effectively is the cost of borrowing money, all right? And as interest rates are higher, people are going to be less likely to borrow money, and as interest rates are lower, people are going to be more likely to borrow money. Meaning that if we have high interest rates, we're going to have lower investment, meaning lower GDP. Whereas if we have low interest rates, we're going to have higher rates of investment, meaning we're going to have higher GDP. Same thing, it just depends on who's doing the purchase there, I guess you could say, whether it's businesses, borrowing money to buy capital, or if it's people that are spending their paychecks to buy the stuff that they need. And then our foreign purchases effect, which is kind of hard to see here. I realize I'm kind of blocking some of it. Let me see if I can make me smaller. There we go, as good as it's going to get. All right, which is that a high price level is going to make people want to buy stuff from other countries more, right? The example being, right, if you can buy an American-made t-shirt that's $30, or you can buy a Chinese-made t-shirt that's $5, and they're about the same quality, which one are you going to want to buy? The Chinese one, right? And that's what the idea is here. And it's vice versa too, though, right? Say in Canada, their Canadian-made T-shirt is $40, whereas our American-made T-shirt is $30. They're more inclined to buy the American-made T-shirt. And this is something we're going to come back to later on in the course when we get to foreign exchange. But it's good to know that currencies relative to one another can end up impacting our own GDP because of our willingness to buy something. Like I said when we went through GDP, net exports for us is a negative because imports are, they're counted as a negative on GDP. And it's this right here, this foreign purchases effect that ends up causing that. So it's a pretty big deal. Now, shifts in aggregate demand. there's going to be two big things that'll end up changing it. So a change in GDP, pretty much, right? You see the CIGX there. So C being our consumption, I being our investment, G being government spending, and then X being net exports. Anything that changes any of those can end up changing aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is also going to be like regular demand, and that a shift to the right is going to be an increase, whereas a shift to the left is going to be a decrease. So, for example, if there's a brand new trend in America and for whatever reason people are wanting to buy more hot dogs, what's that going to look like? That's right. It's going to shift aggregate demand to the right because now hot dogs are super popular and hot dog sales are at an all-time high. Investment, that's when we start talking about those interest rates. So with that then, as interest rates are higher or lower, it's going to determine how much investment there is. So for example, if interest rates are low, it means there's going to be more investment, and as there's more investment, there's going to be more aggregate demand, and aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. Government spending we're going to talk more about. We haven't really nailed down what that term means yet, so we'll skip over that for now. And then with our net exports, right? For example, say K-pops become super popular in America. That'll end up being a decrease of aggregate demand, meaning it's going to shift to the left because essentially we'll be importing more media, meaning there's going to be more money that is flowing out and giving us that negative effect from imports. And then something else we'll see later on in this unit is a multiplier effect, which will end up producing this huge change based on one or two specific things. And this ends up relating back to that government spending as well. All right. Now, again, an increased aggregate demand is going to go to the right, decrease in aggregate demand is going to go to the left, and that is a pretty big deal. So, look at a shift of aggregate demand here, like I said. With regular demand, you shift to the right, and there you go. That is an increase of aggregate demand. And what it means is that at every part of this output, at every part of this real GDP, there is now a higher price level for it, pretty much, or vice versa, depending on how you look at it. So that said, when you guys are drawing and labeling these, make sure you're differentiating between the two. Kind of saw that some when we did regular supply and demand, but make sure you make one AD and then AD1, or it could be AD 81 and then 82, whatever else it might be. And same goes for demand. So as it shifts to the left, there'll be a lower overall price level as real GDP is going down. So same thing, you either have one on label with a 1 or a 1 then a 2 or whatever it might be. And always draw the arrows to show that you're showing off the change that does happen. Now, determinants of aggregate demand. Again, that's going to be the things that change it. Those are the 4 things that, when impacted, will impact aggregate demand. Consumption. Here's some of the stuff that can end up impacting all of this then. And since aggregate demand is GDP, all of these things will shift our GDP as well, obviously. So consumer wealth. As there's more wealth, there's more spending, meaning that as there's more spending, GDP goes up and aggregate demand shifts to the right. What this means then is that if people are making more money overall, then we'll have an increase in GDP. Right? That's pretty much what it means. Now, as people are making less money overall, which is in a lot of ways the situation right now, then aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. Our GDP for this year right now is about $3 trillion less than what it was last time this year. So there's been some really great examples of all of that. Consumer expectations. Now this is a huge one. Again, in recent times, really great examples of this. And when we're talking about demand, when we're talking about a lot of things in this course, consumer expectations is almost always the biggest factor in it. You see this in financial markets too, especially, is that it's all comes down to expectations. So for example, about 6 months ago, 7 months ago now, people were expecting stuff to get really bad, right? And what was the first thing, memes online about it, whatever it is, that it just completely disappeared out of stores, couldn't find it. That's right, toilet paper. For whatever reason, people expected that, we were on the brink of disaster and there'd be no more toilet paper, which there was. So consumer and expectations can then, drive things out of control to a certain extent. And that could be an example of aggregate demand shifting to the right. Now, all the other situations, end up making a shift to the left overall, but if it was just that one change, it would in fact shift to the right. Now, negative expectations are the same thing. Example with this would be flights, right? Especially 6, 7 months ago, flights were really cheap because no one really wanted to fly anywhere. They were expecting to get sick if they did. So negative expectations then will end up shifting aggregate demand to the left as there's less spending. Household indebtedness. This one's not a huge deal. It's mainly expectations and wealth that we'll end up talking about. These last two are good, but they're not as big of a thing. But what this means is as you have less debt, you'll likely spend more because you have more money freed up. For example, you buy a car, you end up having a car payment for $400 a month for 5 years. All right. That's $400 that you're now paying off financially that you can no longer spend on other stuff. Right, that's the idea. Because the sale of that car was determined back in the year that you bought it, but after that, it's just a bunch of financial transactions, and that doesn't end up getting counted. So that's what that looks like. And then taxes, and this is going to be one of those things of fiscal policy, which comes down to the government portion of all this. But the idea is that less taxes equals more spending, or more taxes equals less spending. It ends up depending. And then we get to government multipliers, so this one is a little disingenuous with what it's saying in some ways. All right. Investment then. Let's see here, make sure I get everything on here this time. Yeah, we'll not worry about this hyperlink, don't worry. Okay, so investment spending then. Like I was saying, it is sensitive to the interest rates. As there's higher interest rates, they're less likely to invest, or as there's lower interest rates, they're more likely to invest, right? People want to borrow money at a cheaper rate. That's how it works. If you want to buy a house, for example, that is considered investment. And people are much more likely to buy a house when they can get a mortgage at a 3% interest rate locked in over 30 years than they are when there's an interest rate of, let's say 7%, right? Because you're essentially paying 4% less over the course of however many years, which ends up, being more than that because of how, interest works. And then expected returns are a huge thing too. And this is, again, those expectations. For example, right? Starting about 6, 7 months ago, we saw a lot of companies switching their production to something that they thought would make them a lot more money. Two really great examples of this being alcohol companies switched to making hand sanitizer, right? They thought they could make more money making hand sanitizer than they could making actual, drinkable alcohol, right? And worked out for them. Another example is making masks. A lot of clothing companies ended up making masks, so they make more money making those than t-shirts. That's how it works. And now as they expect low returns though, for example, right, it's the opposite effect. Aggregate demand ends up decreasing, shifting to the left. So an example, they stop making drinkable alcohol and more clothing in favor of making those other things. So it kind of ends up balancing out in some ways. It's one of those things that's hard to tell. And then expected returns, all of this can be influenced by expectations of the future, right? So again, that's why they would want to shift their production. Technology, right? Say there's, again, we've talked about it already, but electronic cashiers, self-checkout type stuff, right? Businesses see their investment in a self-checkout station over time is going to be a lot cheaper than having to pay someone to do that. Degree of excess capacity, meaning that their current stock that they have we get into this thing called diminishing returns, right? Which I'll explain here in a second. The more they have of something, the less useful it is, right? So, for example, on a personal level, right, you're eating a meal. 1 spoon is pretty good for eating a bowl of soup. You add a second spoon, and it's can help, but realistically, you still need to put it in your mouth and swallow it. So maybe 2 could make you go faster. And then you get to 3 spoons, right? And you don't have 3 hands. So you have 2 spoons in one hand and 1 to the other, and it actually kind of ends up making you do it worse. And that's kind of what this means, is that businesses only need so many machines making goods. They only have so much space for them because at the end of the day, they do need people operating those, and they could end up just making way too much stuff and end up losing money. On a farm, having one tractor is really good. Having two tractors could be good. Having 200 tractors, you probably don't need that many. And that's just how it works. You end up losing money because of it. And then business taxes as well. And that's going to be a huge thing again once we get to fiscal policy, but we're not quite there just yet. All right. Government spending. So, this is a pretty simple one. We'll talk about this more with fiscal policy. But as there's more government spending, aggregate demand shifts to the right. And as there's less government spending, aggregate demand shifts to the left. Some big examples with this, in general, right, once we break down fiscal policy, it'll make more sense. But in general, it's going to be Congress that determines this, nobody else. Doesn't matter, what the news says. It's only Congress that's going to determine our budgeting and government spending. A lot of this is like public work type projects. Historically, a great example is getting out of the Great Depression with all of the different like arts type stuff that FDR promotes, as well as general uplift of cities, things of that nature. It's investing in infrastructure, whatever it is, and then less government spending would be cutting back on those programs, and all of this going to the right there. And then net exports. So these are our things that we're selling and buying from other countries. So it's sensitive to exchange rates, and this is something we'll talk about more when we get to foreign exchange. But the basic idea is that as you have a stronger dollar, which again the U.S. dollar is one of the strongest in the world, if not the you're going to have more imports and fewer exports, making your aggregate demand go to the left, right? Because you're buying more stuff, it's that negative effect, and you end up having negative net exports. As you have a weaker dollar, though, you have fewer imports, right? You're able to afford less from other countries, and people are more willing to buy stuff from you. Meaning that even if your country's not doing so hot and your dollar's not the best, it can end up helping GDP because people want cheap stuff. That's how it works. And then relative income. And there's a pretty heavy correlation between the two here. So strong economies, strong foreign economies will be more exports, making aggregate demand go to the right. For example, the euro compared to the United States is going to be a strong foreign economy, and we'll have a lot of exports to them. Whereas a country like South Sudan, right, we've talked about them before with their, $300 real GDP per capita, they're going to have less. We're going to export less to them because they simply can't afford to buy anything from us. So it just depends. So this is our discussion on aggregate demand here. Something important to talk about, this symbol right here, this little triangle, it's called delta, represents a change in something. So I'll use it sometimes, I won't use it often, but you can use it to say like, change in price level there. Shorthand is always good. And stuff like that. So let me know if you have any questions. Make sure you get the 4, 3, 2, 1 turned in. Yeah, that's all I got.